The night of the Westbrook Charity Gala was supposed to be a celebration. The ballroom shimmered under crystal chandeliers, the air thick with the scent of roses and champagne. New York's elite moved like glittering pieces on a chessboard. Bankers in tuxedos, socialites draped in diamonds, politicians trading promises behind polite laughter. Cameras flashed at the entrance, documenting every arrival for society pages. Emily Carter hadn't wanted to attend. At 7 months pregnant, her ankles ached, her body begged for rest. But Richard insisted. "Appearances matter," he snapped earlier that day. "You're still my wife, for now. People need to see us together." His words stung, but Emily agreed. She dressed in a modest emerald gown, one that gently hugged her growing belly. She told herself she could endure one evening. But Richard had other plans. The moment they entered the ballroom, he let go of her hand. Emily blinked, startled, as he strode ahead, straight to Vanessa Lee, who was already waiting near the champagne fountain in a scarlet gown designed to command attention. Gasps rippled through the crowd as Richard placed his arm around Vanessa's waist, smiling for the cameras as though Emily didn't exist. Whispers spread like wildfire. "Isn't that his wife over there?" And the pregnant one, no less. Shameless. Heads turned toward Emily, standing alone near the entrance, her face pale under the weight of humiliation. She could hear the clicking of cameras capturing every cruel second. Richard raised his glass. "Ladies and gentlemen," he boomed, his voice echoing across the hall. "Tonight, I want to honor not just this wonderful cause, but also the woman who stands beside me, Vanessa Lee." His lips brushed Vanessa's cheek as photographers swarmed. Vanessa's smile was triumphant, her eyes cutting toward Emily with cold satisfaction. Emily's breath caught in her throat. For years she had endured Richard's temper in silence, telling herself it was private, that no one needed to know. But tonight, the betrayal wasn't hidden. It was a spectacle. Every bruise, every insult, every broken promise had led to this. Her husband discarding her in front of 1,000 witnesses. She swayed, gripping the edge of a table for balance. A kind waiter rushed to steady her, whispering, "Do you want me to call someone, ma'am?" Emily shook her head, blinking back tears. She couldn't collapse here. Not in front of them. Not while Richard flaunted his mistress as though she were already his wife. But not everyone in the room sneered. Some guests shifted uncomfortably, glancing at Emily with pity. A few whispered words of support as she passed, though no one dared confront Richard directly. He was too powerful, too arrogant. For now. Yet across the ballroom, another figure watched intently. Alexander Kane stood in the shadows near the balcony doors, dressed in a simple black suit that couldn't disguise the soldier beneath. His jaw tightened as he witnessed the scene, his fists curling at his sides. He hadn't expected to see Emily here. Not like this, not humiliated before the world. The sight ignited something inside him, something forged in battlefields and tempered by loyalty. For Emily, this night felt like the end. But for Alexander, it was the beginning of war. And before the gala ended, Richard Carter would learn what it meant to make an enemy of a man who never loses. The limo ride home from the gala was the longest of Emily's life. Richard didn't sit beside her. He sat across, his hand lazily draped around Vanessa's shoulders, laughing at her whispered jokes. The driver's eyes stayed locked on the road, pretending not to hear the cruelty filling the car. Emily stared at her hands folded over her belly, feeling the baby kick beneath the silk of her gown. Each movement was both a comfort and a dagger. When they reached the penthouse, Richard didn't bother with pretense. He led Vanessa inside as though Emily weren't even there. "Go to bed," he ordered sharply. "You're embarrassing enough without tears." Then, with a grin meant to wound, he added, "Vanessa and I will be using the master bedroom tonight." Emily's heart splintered. She turned away before they could see her crumble, retreating to the guest room, the one that felt more like a storage closet than a refuge. She sat on the edge of the bed, clutching her belly, shaking with sobs that refused to be silenced. All the strength she had clung to through months of insults, through nights of bruises hidden under long sleeves, abandoned her. Tonight was too much. Being betrayed in public, discarded like an object, laughed at by the very man who had vowed to protect her. How could she rise from that? Her reflection in the mirror startled her. Her eyes were red, her face pale and swollen, her once bright smile nowhere to be found. She barely recognized herself. The girl who had once danced barefoot in summer rain, the teacher who lit up classrooms with joy, the woman who dreamed of bedtime stories and lullabies, where had she gone? The baby stirred again, reminding her she wasn't alone. "I'm so sorry," she whispered, her tears soaking the silk of her gown. "You don't deserve this. You don't deserve a father like him." She cradled her belly as though her arms could shield the child from every cruel word, every act of violence. But even as she tried to comfort herself, fear took root. What if Richard hurt the baby next time? What if his rage, stoked by Vanessa's venom, turned deadly? For the first time, Emily wondered if survival was even possible. The hours crawled by. From the master bedroom came muffled laughter, the sound of champagne glasses clinking. Each echo was a knife twisting deeper. Emily pressed her hands against her ears, but the pain was inside, not outside. She curled into herself on the cold bed, trembling until exhaustion finally dragged her into a restless sleep. Dreams brought no comfort. She saw herself standing alone in that glittering ballroom, every eye mocking her, every whisper louder than her voice. She dreamed of Richard raising the club again, Vanessa cheering from the shadows. She woke with a scream, her chest heaving, her gown damp with sweat. For a moment she thought she truly was alone, until a memory surfaced. A name. A face. Alexander Kane. The man who once promised he would protect her, no matter the cost. A promise broken by time, not by choice. But promises have a way of returning when they are needed most. Emily wiped her tears, though her hands still shook. She didn't know it yet, but this night of despair would not be her ending. It would be the moment her silent cry reached the one man capable of turning her nightmare into her husband's reckoning. Because even in her darkest hour, Emily was not forgotten. While Emily lay broken in the dim guest room of her penthouse, another story was unfolding just blocks away. In a private suite at the Ritz-Carlton, Alexander Kane stared out over the glittering skyline of New York City. To the world, he was a billionaire entrepreneur, the mind behind Kane Global Security, a company that protected the world's most powerful people. But before the boardrooms and the Forbes covers, Alexander had been forged in the fire of war, a decorated Navy SEAL who had learned to fight battles most men wouldn't survive. That night, he wasn't attending another gala or entertaining investors. He was studying a file. Emily Carter's file. It had landed on his desk weeks earlier, slipped to him by an old military contact now working in private investigations. At first, he hadn't believed it. The photographs showed a woman with bruises hidden under long sleeves, a belly heavy with child, eyes that once sparkled with hope, now dulled by suffering. He had stared at the images for hours, unable to reconcile them with the Emily he remembered. Emily, the woman who once laughed at his corny jokes, who wrote him letters during his deployments, who told him she believed in him when he doubted himself. She had been his anchor in the chaos of war, the reason he survived the darkest nights. Losing her had been his greatest regret. And now, discovering the truth of her marriage to Richard Carter, reignited a fire he thought he'd buried. Alexander clenched the edge of the desk, his jaw tight. The file included reports from neighbors, hushed rumors from Richard's employees, even a blurry phone video showing Richard's violent temper at home. And then came the final blow, photographs from the gala. Richard flaunting his mistress in front of the cameras while Emily stood alone, humiliated, one hand protectively over her belly. That was the moment Alexander knew. He couldn't stay silent. He couldn't let Emily fight this battle alone. He made a call. "Get the jet ready," he ordered his assistant, "and prepare the team. We'll need surveillance on Richard Carter's properties by morning." On the other end, his head of security hesitated. "Sir, are you saying this is personal?" Alexander's eyes hardened. "It's personal, and it's war." Hours later, as dawn broke over the city, Alexander stood outside the hospital where Emily had been rushed after collapsing from exhaustion. He had tracked her there, his contacts feeding him updates by the hour. He didn't approach her yet. Not while she was fragile. Not while Richard's shadow still loomed over her. Instead, he watched from a distance, his broad frame hidden beneath a simple coat. When Emily was wheeled out, pale but breathing, clutching her belly with trembling hands, Alexander's chest tightened. He wanted to run to her, to take her pain and replace it with the safety she had once given him in his darkest hours. But he knew timing mattered. This wasn't just about reunion. It was about strategy. Richard Carter believed he had won. Vanessa believed she had replaced Emily. The city believed Emily was powerless. But Alexander Kane knew the truth. Emily wasn't alone anymore. And the man she once loved was ready to wage a battle no one saw coming. The hospital room was quiet, save for the steady rhythm of the fetal monitor. Emily sat propped against a stack of pillows, her hair messy, her gown loose, her face pale from exhaustion. She had been discharged hours earlier, but she couldn't bring herself to leave. The thought of returning to the penthouse, to Richard, to Vanessa, was unbearable. For the first time, she admitted the truth to herself. She had no home. But despair wasn't the only thing she felt. Something else had begun to stir inside her. It wasn't loud or obvious. It was small, almost fragile, like the first crack of dawn breaking through endless night. Yet it was there, undeniable. Strength. Her child had survived the collapse, the stress, the violence. The doctors told her the baby's heartbeat was strong. That tiny life inside her was a reminder. She wasn't just a victim. She was a mother. And mothers don't surrender. As she traced her hand across her belly, Emily thought of Richard's sneer, Vanessa's smirk, the cameras flashing while she stood alone in humiliation. For weeks, she had swallowed her pride, telling herself silence was survival. But silence had only given Richard more power. Not anymore. That afternoon, as she walked slowly down the hospital corridor, she heard her name. Turning, she saw a tall man at the far end. Broad shoulders, sharp eyes, a presence that seemed to steady the very air around him. Alexander Kane. Her breath caught. For a moment, time rewound. She saw the young Navy SEAL who once held her hand in a diner, the man who kissed her under 4th of July fireworks, the man she let go because she believed he deserved a brighter future than she could give. Now here he was, older, sharper, but still carrying the same unshakable certainty. "Emily," he said softly, as though the word itself was a promise. Tears pricked her eyes. "Why are you here?" Alexander's jaw tightened. "Because I should never have left, and because I won't let him destroy you." Those words lit a fire inside her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel small. She felt seen, protected, powerful. Within days, everything began to change. Alexander arranged for her to move into a safe townhouse under his company's security. His team ensured Richard couldn't touch her. But Alexander didn't just offer safety. He offered something greater. A mirror. He reminded her who she had been before Richard's cruelty dimmed her light. The passionate teacher, the woman who fought for her students, the girl who believed she was worthy of love. With Alexander's help, Emily transformed. She traded the pale hospital gown for elegant maternity wear that celebrated her strength instead of hiding her condition. She cut her hair shorter, sharper, no longer weighed down by the image of the obedient wife Richard demanded. She began practicing speeches in front of the mirror, her voice trembling at first, then steady, then unbreakable. Every morning she repeated the same words to her reflection. "I am not weak. I am not his victim. I am a mother, and I will fight." The world had seen her humiliated. Soon they would see her reborn. And when Emily Carter rose again, she would not rise quietly. She would rise to burn down the empire built on her suffering. The Westbrook Foundation Gala returned just weeks later. Another night of glittering gowns and tailored suits, where fortunes were flaunted and reputations polished under golden chandeliers. For Richard Carter, it was the perfect stage to flaunt his new life. He entered the ballroom hand in hand with Vanessa Lee, their matching outfits deliberately chosen, his tuxedo cut in sharp lines, her crimson gown clinging like fire to his side. Cameras flashed, guests whispered, and Richard smiled with the arrogance of a man convinced the world had accepted his betrayal. But tonight, Richard was not the only star of the show. As the orchestra swelled and champagne glasses clinked, the heavy doors of the ballroom swung open. Every head turned. Emily Carter stood in the doorway. Gone was the fragile, trembling woman the city had pitied. Tonight, she was radiant, her emerald gown hugging her pregnant figure with pride, not shame. Her hair framed her face in sleek waves, her posture straight, her chin lifted high, and at her side stood Alexander Kane. The room fell silent. Alexander didn't need introduction. His face had graced the covers of Forbes and Time, his reputation as a billionaire ex-Navy SEAL preceding him. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Emily Carter with Alexander Kane? The very idea shattered the narrative Richard had tried to sell. Richard's smirk faltered. Vanessa's hand tightened around his arm. Emily's heels clicked against the marble floor as she entered, each step echoing like a drumbeat of defiance. She didn't rush, didn't cower. She moved with the grace of a woman who had nothing left to fear. Alexander guided her toward the center of the room, his presence a silent warning to anyone who dared whisper too loudly. When they reached the stage, Emily turned to face the crowd. The spotlight found her, and for the first time in months, she welcomed it. "Good evening," she began, her voice clear, steady. "I wasn't planning to speak tonight, but since my husband—" She paused deliberately, her eyes locking on Richard. "Chose this very stage weeks ago to humiliate me. It seems only right that I respond here." A murmur swept the ballroom. Guests leaned forward, hungry for scandal. Emily continued, her voice rising with conviction. "Marriage is not meant to be a weapon. A child is not a burden, and love, real love, cannot coexist with cruelty. I stood silent too long, believing silence would protect me, but silence only gave power to abuse." The crowd gasped. Phones rose discreetly, recording every word. Richard stormed forward, his face red. "Enough, Emily, you will not." But before he could finish, Alexander stepped between them. His stare was cold, unyielding. "Touch her, and you'll answer to me." The tension was electric. Cameras flashed furiously. Richard froze, fury trapped behind clenched teeth. Emily raised her chin higher. "You replaced me in public. Tonight, I replace your lies with truth." From her clutch, she produced a flash drive. Alexander handed it to the events technician. Seconds later, the massive screens behind the stage flickered to life, showing footage of Richard at home, screaming, throwing objects. The infamous moment with the club caught on shaky video. Gasps erupted. Some guests cried out in horror. Richard's empire crumbled in real time, under the unforgiving glare of 1,000 witnesses. Emily's voice cut through the chaos. "This is who he truly is, and I will no longer be silent." The ballroom exploded with whispers, journalists already typing headlines. Vanessa slipped her hand from Richard's arm, stepping back as though distance could save her. Emily reached for Alexander's hand. Together, they stood unshaken. And in that moment, everyone knew Richard Carter's reign was over. The fallout from the gala was immediate. By sunrise, Richard Carter's name was splashed across every headline in New York. Real estate mogul exposed for domestic abuse. Pregnant wife's public stand shatters Carter empire. The video Emily released spread like wildfire, watched by millions who once admired Richard but now recoiled in disgust. His board of directors held an emergency meeting and voted him out within hours. Investors pulled out, clients fled, and the empire he built on arrogance collapsed overnight. Vanessa Lee vanished from the spotlight. She slipped away from Richard the same night, her dreams of diamonds and penthouses dissolving as quickly as they had come. Without his fortune or influence, Richard was of no use to her. By the week's end, she was spotted boarding a one-way flight out of the city, desperate to distance herself from the scandal she helped fuel. Richard himself faced more than financial ruin. Police opened an investigation, the video evidence too damning to ignore. Charges of assault, abuse, and financial fraud stacked high against him. For once, his wealth and lawyers couldn't shield him. The world that once bowed to him now spit him out, and for the first time, Richard Carter was truly powerless. Emily, meanwhile, discovered something she had long forgotten: freedom. In the safety of Alexander Kane's townhouse, she woke each morning without fear of footsteps thundering down the hall, without the dread of whispered insults or sudden violence. She painted the nursery herself, sunlight streaming through the windows, her laughter echoing through the rooms. Alexander often joined her, building cribs and hanging curtains, his large hands gentle as he helped prepare for the baby. Their relationship didn't resume overnight. Emily carried wounds deeper than bruises, scars that needed time to heal. Alexander understood. He didn't push, he simply stayed, steady, loyal, protective. Some nights, when nightmares dragged her back to Richard's shadow, Alexander held her hand until the tremors faded. Other nights, he reminded her of the woman she once was, and the stronger woman she had become. When her baby was born, a healthy daughter with her mother's bright eyes, Emily wept. Not with sorrow, but with gratitude. She named her Grace, because that's what she had been given. The grace to endure, to rise, to begin again. Weeks later, Emily stood on a stage again, but this time by choice. She launched the Carter Foundation for Women and Children, funded by Alexander and supported by thousands inspired by her story. Her voice carried through the hall, not trembling, but steady and powerful. "No woman should ever feel silenced," she declared. "No child should ever grow up in fear. We may be broken, but broken people can rebuild. We can rise stronger." Applause thundered. Some guests cried openly, moved by her courage. Cameras flashed, but this time Emily didn't shrink from them. She welcomed the light, knowing she had turned her pain into purpose. Afterward, Alexander joined her on stage. He didn't steal the spotlight, didn't claim credit. He simply placed a hand on her shoulder, a silent reminder that she was never alone again. Emily smiled, her daughter safe in her arms, her future no longer chained to the cruelty of her past. She had not just survived, she had triumphed. And as the world watched, Emily Carter proved that strength is not measured by the blows we endure, but by the courage to rise after we've been struck down like knives. Richard Carter, once the golden boy of Manhattan real estate, had become the city's most despised villain. He arrived at his arraignment in a wrinkled suit, his hair unkempt, his eyes hollow. Reporters shouted his name, microphones shoved at his face. "Richard, do you deny the abuse? Richard, is it true your wife nearly lost the baby? Richard, where's Vanessa now?" Each question was another stone hurled at his collapsing empire. Richard lowered his head, but the flashbulb showed everything. The sweat, the fear, the humiliation of a man who had believed himself untouchable. Inside the courtroom, the atmosphere was suffocating. Emily sat quietly in the front row, her daughter Grace in her arms, Alexander by her side. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her presence alone was a verdict. The prosecution laid out evidence like daggers on the table. Photos of bruises, financial documents proving embezzlement, the infamous video from the gala, testimony from employees who had endured his wrath. Piece by piece, the mask Richard wore for years shattered before the world. Vanessa was nowhere to be seen. She had already cut ties, selling her silence to the tabloids in exchange for a payout that wouldn't last. The woman Richard once called his future had abandoned him to rot. For the first time, Richard was truly alone. When the judge denied his bail, a gasp rippled through the courtroom. The guards stepped forward, clamping cuffs around his wrists. Richard's eyes darted across the room, desperate, searching for anyone to defend him. But no one did. Not the board members who once toasted him. Not the friends who once dined with him. And certainly not Emily, who stared back with calm resolve. The journey from penthouse luxury to a concrete cell was brutal. Reporters trailed him every step, capturing the image of a man in chains. The same city that once celebrated his rise now relished his fall. Headlines screamed across every paper, from CEO to convict, "The fall of Richard Carter." In his cell, the silence was unbearable. The marble floors and glass walls of his penthouse had been replaced by cold concrete and rusted bars. Instead of silk sheets, he slept on a thin cot that stank of mildew. Instead of Vanessa's laughter, he heard the jeers of inmates who recognized his disgraced face from the news. Nights were the worst. Alone in the darkness, Richard replayed the gala in his mind. The moment Emily stood against him. The moment Alexander blocked his path. The moment the crowd gasped at his exposed violence. He had thought her weak, a fragile schoolteacher. Now he realized she had become stronger than he could ever be. For the first time, Richard felt fear. Not fear of the law or the prison walls, but fear of irrelevance. He had lived for power, for attention, for control. Now, stripped of it all, he was nothing. Meanwhile, outside the prison walls, Emily's star was rising. Her foundation grew rapidly, her story inspiring women worldwide. Interviews, features, donations poured in. While Richard rotted in disgrace, Emily thrived in purpose. The man who tried to break her had built his own prison, and Emily Carter had finally walked free. While Richard languished behind prison walls, Vanessa Lee believed she could outrun the storm. She packed her designer gowns into glossy suitcases, slipped into a chauffeured car, and headed straight for JFK Airport. Her plan was simple: disappear for a few months, let the scandal cool, then reinvent herself somewhere far away. But scandals of this size don't simply vanish. By the time Vanessa reached the airport lounge, her face was already plastered across tabloids. Homewrecker on the run. The other woman who helped destroy Carter Empire. Paparazzi swarmed her like vultures, their flashes unforgiving. She tried to hide behind oversized sunglasses, but there was no hiding anymore. The public had decided Vanessa wasn't glamorous. She was toxic. Her credit cards, once linked to Richard's accounts, were suddenly declined. The penthouse apartment Richard promised her was locked. The doorman instructed never to let her return. Friends who once cheered her ambition stopped answering calls. The invitations dried up, the smiles disappeared, and the city that once opened doors for her now slammed them shut. In desperation, Vanessa attempted to sell her story to the press. She strutted into newsrooms with rehearsed lines, claiming she was a victim too, that Richard manipulated her, that she never knew the full truth. But the reporters weren't buying it. They played clips of her laughing at Richard's side, flaunting jewels, smirking while Emily stood humiliated. The public saw her not as a victim, but as an accomplice. Every article shredded what was left of her reputation. Vanessa Lee, the mistress who cheered the abuse. She became a punchline in late-night shows, her name trending for all the wrong reasons. Even brands she once modeled for publicly cut ties, issuing statements that they would never condone her behavior. At night, Vanessa stared at her reflection in the mirror of a cheap motel, stripped of the glamour she had once weaponized. Without Richard's money, she couldn't afford stylists or diamonds. Her hair lost its shine, her designer gowns sat useless in her suitcase. The woman she saw staring back wasn't a queen. She was a cautionary tale. The betrayal she thought would secure her future had instead destroyed it. The cruelest twist was that Richard had never truly loved her. To him, she was entertainment, a pawn to inflate his ego. And when his empire crumbled, she was left with nothing. No loyalty, no wealth, no safety net. Word spread that Vanessa tried moving to Los Angeles, then Miami, chasing opportunities, but doors slammed before she could knock. Social media mocked her relentlessly. Former admirers called her the woman who laughed at a pregnant wife's pain. She couldn't escape her past because the internet never forgets. Meanwhile, Emily's foundation was everywhere. Billboards, interviews, news specials, all carried Emily's radiant face, her story of survival, her mission to protect women and children. Every success Emily achieved was a reminder to Vanessa of the life she had tried and failed to steal. One rainy evening, Vanessa sat in a diner, scrolling through her phone. She saw Emily holding baby Grace, Alexander at her side, both smiling under the headline, "From Victim to Victor, Emily Carter inspires millions." Vanessa's hands trembled. She whispered to herself, "That should have been me." But deep down she knew the truth. It never could have been. Because crowns built on cruelty always crumble. And for Vanessa Lee, the mirror was her prison, reflecting a future forever stained by the choices she made. In the weeks that followed Richard's downfall and Vanessa's disgrace, Emily found herself navigating a new world. It was brighter, freer, but also overwhelming. Reporters still called daily, organizations begged for her presence, and strangers sent letters thanking her for her courage. Emily had stepped out of the shadows, but with that light came pressure. And in those fragile days of rebuilding, Alexander Kane became more than just a protector. He became her anchor. Alexander was no stranger to rebuilding lives. As a Navy SEAL, he had pulled men from battlefields, patched wounds under fire, and carried survivors through chaos. Later, as a billionaire security magnate, he built systems that shielded leaders and nations. But helping Emily was different. This wasn't about contracts or missions. This was personal. He began with the basics. Safety. His company installed discreet security systems in Emily's townhouse, ensuring no one could come near her or baby Grace without permission. His team vetted everyone, nannies, doctors, even delivery services, removing any shadow of threat. For the first time since her wedding day, Emily slept peacefully, knowing no knock at the door could bring Richard's wrath. But Alexander offered more than protection. He offered restoration. He encouraged Emily to reclaim her identity outside of Richard's shadow. One afternoon, he surprised her with a visit to her old elementary school. The children erupted with joy, running to their beloved teacher. Emily's eyes filled with tears as she hugged them, realizing she was still the woman who had once lit up a classroom. That day, she decided to return to teaching part-time, balancing it with her foundation. Alexander also pushed her to dream again. When Emily hesitated to take the stage at a national conference for women's rights, he reminded her of the strength she already carried. "You faced worse than a room full of strangers," he said gently, "and you didn't just survive, you conquered." His belief in her was unshakable, and it became the bridge she walked across to believe in herself. Slowly, Emily's laughter returned. The sound filled Alexander's townhouse, bouncing off walls that had once felt cold. Baby Grace giggled with her mother, and sometimes, nestled in Alexander's arms, she cooed as if she knew she was safe with him. Yet Alexander never tried to replace Richard as a father. He respected Emily's boundaries, knowing healing wasn't a race. He simply showed up. Every day, every night, every time Emily needed a steady hand or a silent listener. When the weight of her past threatened to crush her, he reminded her she was more than her scars. Behind closed doors, though, Alexander fought his own battle. For years, he had buried the memory of Emily, telling himself she deserved a simpler life than one tied to a soldier's ghosts. Seeing her again reignited feelings he had long suppressed. But he knew he couldn't confess them too soon. This wasn't about what he wanted. It was about what she needed. And right now, she needed space to heal. So he remained her guardian, her friend, her shield. The world saw Emily Carter as a symbol of survival. But in quiet moments, Alexander saw her as something more. The woman who had once saved him from himself. The woman he was determined never to lose again. And though he hadn't spoken the words yet, Alexander knew this truth. His battle wasn't just to protect Emily's life. It was to protect her heart. At first, Emily Carter never planned to lead a movement. She only wanted to survive. But survival has a way of blooming into something larger when truth finds its voice. What began as a small fund to support shelters for women quickly grew into a national phenomenon. The Carter Foundation for Women and Children spread across newspapers, television, and social media. The first fundraising dinner was modest, just 50 guests in a borrowed hall, with Alexander quietly covering the costs. Emily stood at the podium, her hands trembling, her voice wavering as she thanked the donors. She spoke not as a polished leader, but as a woman scarred by experience. "I am proof," she said softly, "that silence is dangerous, but speaking can save lives." The room erupted in applause. Donations doubled by the end of the night. Soon, invitations poured in. Universities wanted her to speak. Television shows asked for interviews. Survivors across the country wrote letters, telling Emily that her courage gave them strength to leave their abusers, to seek safety, to believe in healing. Each letter became a thread in a tapestry of hope that Emily carried with her. She grew into her role with surprising grace. Standing on national stages, she no longer shook. Her voice rang clear, strong, carried by the weight of truth. "We cannot undo the past," she declared at one conference, "but we can build a future where women and children never have to choose between silence and survival." Her words weren't just speeches. They were lifelines. The foundation expanded rapidly. Safe houses opened in 3 states, then 5, then 10. Hotlines were established, staffed by counselors ready to answer calls at any hour. Legal teams partnered with the foundation to provide free representation for women trapped in abusive marriages. Emily oversaw it all, balancing late-night feedings with boardroom meetings. Her daughter Grace often nestled in her arms as she signed documents. For Emily, this wasn't just work, it was redemption. Every brick laid in a shelter, every case won in court, every woman who walked into safety was another piece of her broken heart restored. But not everyone celebrated her rise. Powerful men in Richard's circle whispered against her, calling her foundation a circus, dismissing her as a bitter ex-wife. Emily faced smear campaigns, online attacks, and subtle threats. Yet she refused to back down. Each attempt to silence her only fueled her determination. Through it all, Alexander remained at her side. He sat quietly in the back row during her speeches, his presence steady, his eyes proud. When the weight grew heavy, he reminded her of the children who now slept peacefully in safe houses because of her. "That's your legacy, Emily," he whispered. "Not the pain Richard gave you, the hope you give them." And slowly, the world began to see Emily not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as a leader. Magazines called her the voice of the voiceless. Newspapers named her one of the most influential women of the year. The girl from Ohio, who once believed her only dream was a quiet family, had become a symbol of power, resilience, and change. And as her star rose higher, Emily Carter realized something profound. Richard had tried to erase her. Instead, he had helped create a force he could never defeat. Richard Carter had lost almost everything: his company, his mistress, his penthouse, his reputation. But prison walls do strange things to men like him. Instead of remorse, Richard fed on rage. Each sleepless night on his thin cot, he whispered the same vow: "If Emily thinks she's free, she's wrong. I'll take back everything she stole from me." Though stripped of wealth, Richard still had contacts. Old cronies from his real estate empire, corrupt fixers who owed him favors, men who didn't care about morality as long as the price was right. In the shadows, Richard began to weave a new plan. Through coded letters passed by guards and whispered phone calls, he reached out. He promised money hidden offshore, property deeds never disclosed, rewards for loyalty. And slowly his web reformed. The target was obvious: Emily. She had humiliated him in front of the world, turned him into a laughingstock, raised their daughter under the protection of another man. Each headline about her foundation, each smiling photo of her with Alexander, twisted his fury into obsession. To Richard, this wasn't just revenge. It was reclamation. One evening, as Emily prepared for another fundraising gala, Alexander received an encrypted alert from his security team. A break-in attempt had been detected at one of the foundation's safe houses. No women were harmed, but documents were stolen, sensitive files with names and locations of survivors Emily had vowed to protect. Alexander's jaw tightened. "Richard," he muttered. He knew the man's patterns, his arrogance. This wasn't random, it was calculated. Emily's face paled when she learned the news. "He's still coming after us," she whispered, holding Grace close. "Yes," Alexander said, his voice low but firm. "And that means he's desperate." The attacks escalated. Anonymous donations to the foundation were revealed as poisoned, wired from accounts linked to Richard's allies, designed to spark financial investigations. Social media bots spread lies, claiming Emily fabricated her abuse for fame. A masked intruder was caught on camera, lurking outside Emily's townhouse, vanishing before guards could intercept. Each strike was subtle, deniable, yet Emily knew exactly who was behind it. Richard wasn't done. From the shadows, he clawed at her new life, trying to unravel the safety she had built. But Emily wasn't the woman he once controlled. Instead of crumbling, she doubled her security, strengthened her foundation, and stood taller at every event. "He wants me afraid," she told Alexander. "But I won't give him that satisfaction." Alexander studied her, pride flickering in his eyes. She had transformed pain into power, yet he also knew Richard's obsession was dangerous. A man with nothing left to lose is the most unpredictable enemy. In a dim prison cell, Richard smirked as news of his sabotage reached him through hidden channels. He imagined Emily trembling, Alexander scrambling. He convinced himself he was winning again. But what Richard didn't know was that Alexander Kane had already begun his counterattack. He had his own network, larger, sharper, forged from military precision and billionaire resources. For every shadow Richard sent, Alexander shined a floodlight. And soon Richard's last desperate move would lead him not to victory, but to the final destruction of everything he clung to. Because when snakes strike from the dark, sometimes they forget. The eagle hunts from above. Richard Carter believed his sabotage was working. He pictured Emily sleepless, terrified, doubting herself. In his mind, every stolen document, every online smear, every shadow lurking outside her townhouse meant he was clawing back control. But Richard had underestimated two things: Emily's resilience and Alexander Kane's brilliance. Alexander didn't just protect, he strategized. Years as a Navy SEAL had taught him the art of patience, the value of traps, and the deadly power of letting the enemy think he was winning. So while Richard celebrated in his cell, Alexander was already pulling strings behind the scenes. The break-in at the safe house had been anticipated. Alexander's team had allowed certain files to be stolen, decoys laced with digital trackers. Each document carried invisible codes that revealed locations, contacts, and even the devices they were opened on. Within days, Alexander had a map of Richard's network: ex-employees, shady lawyers, offshore account managers. One by one, they lit up on his screen like targets on a battlefield. Emily watched as Alexander laid the evidence before her. He thinks he's hurting us, Alexander explained calmly, but all he's done is show us where to strike. Her heart raced. So you're saying he's walking into his own trap? Alexander nodded. Exactly. The next stage was psychological. Alexander leaked selective information to Richard's allies, false whispers about hidden money, secret leverage, and a supposed informant within Richard's own circle. Paranoia spread quickly. Allies began turning on each other, accusing, betraying, collapsing the fragile web Richard had spun. In prison, Richard grew furious. His calls were returned less often, his letters unanswered. He slammed fists against the concrete wall, convinced someone had betrayed him. His obsession with Emily twisted into obsession with finding the traitor who didn't exist. Meanwhile, Alexander orchestrated a sting. Using one of Richard's most loyal fixers, a man named Cole Avery, Alexander planted bait, a supposed loophole that could erase Emily's testimony and discredit her foundation. Cole, greedy for Richard's promised payout, took the bait. But when he opened the files, federal agents were already watching, guided by Alexander's digital trail. Within hours, Cole was arrested, and with him came a treasure trove of evidence linking Richard to every sabotage attempt. The news broke like thunder. Ex-CEO Richard Carter caught running crime ring from prison. The public, already disgusted with him, erupted in outrage. Prosecutors announced new charges: conspiracy, intimidation, tampering. His sentence would no longer be counted in years, but in decades. Emily read the headlines with tears in her eyes. For months she had lived under Richard's shadow, bracing for his next strike. Now she saw the truth. Alexander had not only defended her but dismantled the monster who haunted her. When she turned to him, her voice was shaky but firm. "You didn't just protect me, you freed me." Alexander's eyes softened. "No, Emily, you freed yourself. I just made sure he never had the chance to cage you again." In his cell, Richard raged like a caged animal, screaming at guards, swearing vengeance. But no one listened anymore. The empire was gone. The allies were gone. The mistress was gone. And now, even his power in the shadows had been ripped away. The hunter had become the hunted. And Alexander Kane had ensured that Richard Carter's final chapter would be written not in wealth and arrogance, but in chains and silence. For months, Emily Carter had carried her pain like a secret weight. Silent bruises, whispered fears, sleepless nights filled with the echo of Richard's voice. Even after his arrest, even after his empire collapsed, the shadow of what he had done clung to her heart. Freedom was not instant. Healing was not automatic. But sometimes healing arrives in unexpected ways. It happened one spring morning at the Carter Foundation headquarters. Emily had just finished a long meeting about opening 3 new safe houses when one of her staff handed her a thick stack of letters. "These came in for you," the young woman said softly. Emily carried them into her office, sat at her desk, and began reading. The first letter was from a woman in Kansas. "Because of you, I left the man who hurt me. My children and I are safe tonight." The second was from a teenager in Chicago. "I thought no one would believe me. But when I saw you speak on TV, I knew I wasn't alone." The third came from a shelter director in Texas. "Your foundation funded the beds that saved 3 mothers and their babies this week. Thank you." Page after page the words poured out: gratitude, hope, survival. Emily's vision blurred as tears welled in her eyes. For the first time, the weight she carried didn't feel like a burden. It felt like purpose. Her chest shook as sobs broke free, but these weren't the quiet sobs of despair she once cried in the cold guest room of her penthouse. These were tears of release, tears of knowing that her suffering had not been meaningless, that her voice had sparked thousands of others. Alexander entered quietly, holding baby Grace in his arms. He paused at the doorway, watching Emily with the letters spread before her like wings. "You okay?" he asked gently. Emily nodded through her tears. "For the first time? Yes, I think I am." She stood, crossing the room to lift Grace into her arms. The baby cooed, her tiny fingers gripping Emily's necklace. Emily kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering, "We're safe now. Truly safe." In that moment, Emily felt the last chain break inside her. Richard's cruelty no longer defined her. The humiliation no longer haunted her. The scars would remain, but they were no longer marks of weakness. They were proof of survival. Later that evening, she and Alexander took Grace to the park. The cherry blossoms had bloomed, scattering pink petals across the grass. Emily sat on a bench, Grace asleep in her stroller, while Alexander sat beside her. "Do you ever think about the past?" Emily asked softly. Alexander looked at her, his eyes steady. "Every day. But I don't live there anymore, and neither should you." Emily smiled faintly, gazing at the blossoms fluttering in the wind. "For so long, I thought my story ended the night he hit me. But now I see that was just the beginning." Alexander placed his hand over hers. "Exactly. And the best chapters are still ahead." Emily leaned against him, her heart lighter than it had been in years. And as the blossoms drifted around her, Emily Carter finally understood. The storm had passed, and she was free to breathe again. The ballroom at the Waldorf Astoria glittered brighter than it ever had. Crystal chandeliers cascaded golden light across velvet drapes, the air buzzing with anticipation. Tonight wasn't just another gala. It was a celebration of Emily Carter, the woman who turned tragedy into triumph, the survivor who had ignited a movement. Guests from across the nation gathered: senators, philanthropists, celebrities, survivors, and supporters. Each wore a small silver ribbon pinned to their attire, the symbol of the Carter Foundation. News crews lined the edges of the hall, cameras ready to capture every moment. Emily stood backstage, adjusting the simple yet elegant navy gown she had chosen for the evening. She no longer needed flashy jewels or borrowed gowns to prove her worth. Her strength was her crown now. She glanced at baby Grace, asleep in a bassinet beside her, and smiled. Then she turned to Alexander, who waited like a silent guardian in his dark suit. "You ready?" he asked. Emily exhaled, steady and calm. "For the first time in my life, yes." When she stepped onto the stage, the room erupted in applause. The sound washed over her like a tide, loud, warm, unstoppable. She paused, overwhelmed, tears threatening to rise before raising her hand in gratitude. The applause softened, replaced by a reverent silence. "Months ago," Emily began, her voice clear, "I stood in this very city as a woman broken. I was humiliated, abused, left to believe I had no voice. But tonight, I stand before you not as a victim, not even just as a survivor, but as a fighter. And I stand for every woman and child who deserves safety, dignity, and hope." The crowd erupted again, some rising to their feet. Cameras flashed, capturing the image of a woman who had walked through fire and emerged unburned. She continued, "The Carter Foundation is not mine alone. It belongs to every person who believed silence was their only option. It belongs to every child who now sleeps safely in our shelters. It belongs to every survivor who chose life over fear. Together, we are rewriting the story." A standing ovation shook the ballroom. Tears streamed down faces in the audience. Survivors embraced one another, whispering words of gratitude. Emily's message had transcended her pain. It had become a beacon for thousands. Then came the surprise. The host of the evening stepped forward, holding a gleaming award. "On behalf of the nation," he declared, "we present Emily Carter with the Humanitarian of the Year award." Emily gasped softly, placing a hand over her chest. The golden plaque glistened under the lights as it was placed in her hands. The audience roared, the sound echoing like thunder. Alexander moved to her side, his hand resting gently at her back, his pride unmistakable. Emily turned to him, eyes brimming with tears, and whispered, "We did it." "No," he corrected softly, his voice meant only for her. "You did it." At that moment, Emily lifted the award high, her daughter safe in the wings, her ally at her side, and the world cheering for her. And in that radiant ballroom, Emily Carter's victory was no longer just personal, it was universal. Her survival had become everyone's celebration. Months passed after the glittering celebration, and Emily Carter's life slowly settled into something she once believed impossible: peace. Gone were the days of waking in fear, bracing for insults or violence. Now, mornings began with Grace's soft laughter echoing through sunlit rooms, and evenings ended with the quiet comfort of safety. Emily had chosen to remain in the modest townhouse Alexander first secured for her. She could have moved into a mansion, bought luxury, surrounded herself with the wealth now at her disposal through speaking tours and her foundation. But she wanted Grace to grow up in a home built on warmth, not on marble floors and cold chandeliers. Fresh flowers sat on the kitchen table, baby toys scattered across the living room, the air filled with laughter instead of tension. It wasn't grand, but it was real. Her foundation flourished. With chapters opening in more states, Emily spent her days traveling to shelters, meeting women whose stories mirrored her own. She knelt to hug children who clung to her with grateful eyes, spoke with mothers who whispered, "Because of you, we're free." Each encounter deepened her sense of purpose. She wasn't just surviving anymore, she was leading. And through it all, Alexander remained a steady presence. He never forced his way into her future, but instead walked beside her, offering support, wisdom, and patience. He helped with Grace's late-night feedings, rocked her to sleep when Emily was exhausted, and built toy castles on the living room floor with the seriousness of a soldier planning strategy. Grace adored him, giggling whenever he tossed her gently into the air, reaching for him with tiny fingers. One evening, after a long day of meetings, Emily returned home to find Alexander in the backyard, helping Grace toddle across the grass. The sight stopped her in her tracks. For a moment she simply watched, her daughter's delighted squeals, Alexander's gentle laughter, the glow of sunset painting them in gold. A warmth spread through her chest, deeper than gratitude, deeper than friendship. It was love, quiet but undeniable. Later, as they sat together on the porch, Emily whispered, "I never thought I'd get here. I never thought I'd have this." Alexander looked at her, his eyes soft. "You earned it, Emily. Every step, every scar, every choice brought you here. Don't ever think it was luck. This peace, you fought for it." Tears welled in her eyes, but this time they weren't heavy. They were light, cleansing. She leaned her head against his shoulder, Grace asleep in her arms. For the first time, Emily allowed herself to imagine a future not defined by fear, but by love. The community around her saw it too. Neighbors greeted her warmly, parents from her old school invited her back, even strangers stopped her in grocery stores to thank her. She had become more than a survivor. She was a symbol of hope, proof that life after devastation wasn't just possible, but beautiful. Emily Carter had rebuilt her life from ashes, and this new life wasn't just hers. It was Grace's, Alexander's, and every survivor who drew strength from her story. And as she looked out at the twilight sky, Emily knew one truth. The past no longer owned her. The future was hers to write. Years had passed since that dark night in the penthouse when Richard raised a club against his pregnant wife. What was once a story of pain had become one of triumph, and Emily Carter's name was no longer whispered with pity, but spoken with reverence. The Carter Foundation had grown far beyond what Emily ever dreamed. What began in a borrowed hall with 50 donors now spanned across the nation, with safe houses in nearly every major city. Hotlines answered thousands of calls each month. Courtrooms echoed with victories for survivors whose voices had finally been heard. And behind it all was Emily, the woman who turned her own suffering into a beacon of hope. Her daughter, Grace, thrived. She grew up not with memories of violence, but surrounded by love. Her first steps had been taken in the safety of their garden. Her first words cheered on by both her mother and Alexander. By the time Grace started school, she already understood her mother's story, not as a tale of tragedy, but as proof of strength. "My mommy helps people," she told her classmates proudly. Emily often wondered how different her life might have been if Richard had succeeded in breaking her spirit. But she never lingered on that thought for long. She had learned that looking backward only gave power to the past. Instead, she chose to look forward, toward Grace's laughter, toward the women she continued to fight for, toward the future she had built with her own resilience. And then, there was Alexander. Through the years, his role in Emily's life deepened. He had been her protector, then her partner in rebuilding, and finally, her companion in love. Their bond was not rushed but forged slowly, with patience and respect. One summer evening, beneath the glow of lanterns strung across the garden, Alexander knelt before her with Grace cheering behind him and asked the question he had carried silently for years. "Emily, you've always been my strength. Will you let me be yours for the rest of our lives?" Her answer came not with hesitation but with certainty. Yes. The wedding was small, intimate, not a show of wealth, but a celebration of survival and love. Survivors, Emily had helped, stood beside her as bridesmaids. Grace carried flowers down the aisle, and when Emily walked toward Alexander, she felt not like the woman Richard tried to destroy, but the woman she had always been meant to become. News outlets covered it with headlines like, "From survivor to bride, Emily Carter finds her happy ending." But Emily knew it wasn't an ending at all. It was another beginning. Her legacy reached far beyond her personal happiness. Universities taught her story in social work classes. Lawmakers cited her foundation when drafting stronger protections for women and children. And in living rooms across America, survivors watched her interviews and whispered, "If she could rise, maybe I can too." One evening, years later, Emily sat on the porch with Grace by her side, now a teenager. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Grace leaned against her mother and asked, "Mom, do you ever regret it? Everything you went through?" Emily paused, her heart heavy with memory, yet light with peace. She looked at her daughter, at Alexander tending the garden nearby, at the life she had built. And she smiled. "No, sweetheart," she whispered, "because my pain became our strength, and our strength became hope for others. That's our legacy." And as the stars appeared overhead, Emily Carter's story closed, not in tragedy, but in triumph, etched forever as proof that no darkness can extinguish the light of a woman who refuses to be broken. So the story has closed. Are you still here with us? If you're still watching, then something in this tale has landed on your heart, and that's exactly why stories like this matter. The lesson is simple but powerful. Your worth is not defined by someone else's choices. Resilience is not a loud act of revenge, but a quiet commitment to rebuild, to set clear boundaries, and to choose dignity over drama. Healing often arrives in small, steady steps. Reaching out to a friend, saying no to what hurts you, and accepting help when it's offered. Stoic wisdom reminds us where strength truly lives. You have power over your mind, not outside events. Realize this, and you will find strength. And when despair threatens, remember Epictetus, it's not what happens to you, but how you react to it that matters. Treat those lines as practical tools, not just words. Inner work is real medicine. If this story gave you a moment of clarity or comfort, please like, share, and subscribe. Your support lets us keep telling stories that heal. Thank you for staying with us. It means more than you know. The sound of shattering glass echoed through the grand penthouse, followed by a scream that froze the air. Emily Carter, 7 months pregnant, stumbled backward as her husband, Richard, raised a heavy wooden club. His face twisted with rage, veins bulging on his forehead. "You're nothing but a burden," he roared, his voice shaking the marble walls. Emily's trembling hands instinctively shielded her swollen belly. The child inside her kicked, as if sensing the danger. Tears streamed down her pale cheeks, her breath ragged and desperate. She tried to beg, but Richard's fury was already unleashed. The club slammed down again, grazing her arm before smashing the glass table beside her. From the corner, Vanessa Lee, Richard's young mistress, watched with a cruel smirk. Her diamond earrings sparkled under the chandelier, but her eyes glittered with venom. "Don't be so dramatic, Richard," she purred. "She's just slowing you down. End this marriage and be with me." Her words cut deeper than the wounds on Emily's body. Once, she believed Richard was her protector, her partner. Now, he was a monster in an expensive suit, striking her while another woman laughed. Emily's knees buckled, and she collapsed onto the cold marble floor. Blood trickled from a cut on her temple, staining the white silk of her nightgown. She clutched her belly, whispering to her unborn child, "Stay with me, please. Stay with me." Richard tossed the club aside, adjusting his tie with a chilling calm. "Sign the divorce papers tomorrow," he sneered. "I'm done pretending." He extended his hand to Vanessa, pulling her close in front of his broken wife. "From now on, she means nothing." Emily lay helpless, her vision blurring. But as her body trembled with pain, her mind clung to one memory, a name. Alexander Kane. The man she once loved, the Navy SEAL who promised he would always protect her. He was gone, but somewhere in her heart, she prayed he would return. And soon, the world would learn. When a soldier becomes a billionaire, his vengeance is unstoppable. "You think I'm finished, Richard?" Emily whispered faintly. "You have no idea what's coming." Before the bruises, before the betrayal, before the night her husband raised a club against her, Emily Carter was the kind of woman people admired quietly but never fully noticed. She wasn't the loudest voice in a room, nor the flashiest presence at a party, but she carried a quiet grace that made strangers smile and children run toward her. At 28, Emily was a dedicated elementary school teacher. She spent her days in a classroom filled with bright drawings, worn-out storybooks, and laughter that spilled into the hallways. Her students adored her patience, her way of making every child feel like the most important person in the world. For Emily, teaching was never just a job. It was a calling. She believed children deserved kindness, safety, and encouragement, things she herself had longed for growing up. Emily hadn't come from wealth or privilege. Raised in a small Ohio town, she learned early about sacrifice. Her father worked double shifts at a factory until his health gave out. Her mother cleaned houses to keep food on the table. Emily grew up wearing second-hand clothes and studying under the dim light of a thrift store lamp. Yet despite the hardship, she carried hope like a flame no storm could extinguish. She dreamed of building a family rooted in love, not struggle. When Richard Carter entered her life, she thought her prayers had been answered. He was older, charming, and ambitious. A real estate executive who swept her off her feet with roses, expensive dinners, and promises of forever. He made her believe she had finally escaped the cycle of hardship. But promises can be poison wrapped in silk. In the early days, Richard's attention made her glow. He would hold her hand in public, brag about her intelligence, even talk about how much he wanted children. When Emily found out she was pregnant, she thought their bond would deepen. She imagined reading bedtime stories, decorating a nursery, and finally living the life she had dreamed of as a little girl staring at the stars through her cracked bedroom window. Instead, the pregnancy revealed Richard's true nature. His patience thinned, his temper sharpened. He complained about expenses, called her weak when morning sickness kept her in bed, and accused her of trapping him with the baby. At first, Emily convinced herself it was stress. She prayed he would return to the man she married. But each month, his cruelty grew, and alongside it came Vanessa, the mistress who flaunted her youth and beauty like weapons. Emily endured it all in silence, telling herself she had to be strong for the baby. Her biggest fear wasn't losing Richard. It was her child growing up without stability, without safety. Yet, deep in her soul, Emily carried a strength Richard could never break. She had survived poverty. She had carried her students through their own struggles. And now, despite the bruises and the betrayal, she would carry her unborn child with everything she had left. That strength was invisible to most, but not to one man. Long before Richard, there had been another. A man who knew Emily's worth before the world had tried to bury it. His name was Alexander Kane, and though fate had pulled them apart years ago, destiny was about to pull him back into her life, right when she needed him most. For Emily Carter, this wasn't just survival. It was the beginning of a reckoning. New York City at night was a theater of power. Towers of glass reached for the heavens, glowing with the arrogance of men who thought they owned the world. On the streets below, luxury cars glided like sharks, their tinted windows hiding secrets as deep as the ocean. In penthouses high above, crystal chandeliers burned like false stars, casting light on the kind of wealth that could either protect or destroy lives. This was Richard Carter's world, a stage of gala nights, business deals whispered over champagne, and mistresses dressed like royalty. He craved the spotlight, feeding on the envy of others. For him, love was never enough. He wanted power, recognition, and the illusion that he was untouchable. The Carters' penthouse reflected that hunger. Glass walls framed the skyline, every surface polished to perfection. Marble floors echoed footsteps like drumbeats, and imported art lined the halls, more trophy than treasure. It wasn't a home, it was a monument to Richard's ego. Emily, who once longed for warmth and family, had tried to fill it with flowers, baby clothes, and the smell of home-cooked meals. But her touches were swallowed by the cold, sterile luxury around her. Beyond the penthouse, Richard's empire spread through New York like wildfire. His company, Carter Real Estate Holdings, bought and flipped buildings with ruthless efficiency. Employees whispered of his temper, but no one dared confront him. Success made him bold, and the city's elite invited him to every gala, every benefit, every gathering where reputations were built or destroyed under the flash of cameras. At these events, Emily was once paraded as the perfect wife. She wore gowns he chose, smiled when he demanded it, and stood silently at his side while he charmed investors. But as her belly grew, her presence became inconvenient. Richard preferred Vanessa, sleek, younger, eager to play the role Emily no longer could. Emily's absence at the glittering parties was whispered about, fueling gossip columns that speculated on the trouble in paradise. For Emily, these spaces were suffocating. She belonged in classrooms filled with crayons and chalk dust, not in ballrooms where men measured each other by the weight of their wallets. Yet this was the arena where her husband thrived, where he flaunted his mistress openly, and where betrayal wasn't just private, it was public spectacle. What Richard never realized was that this same world of power and wealth also belonged to another man. Alexander Kane had once walked these very halls as a silent observer. A decorated Navy SEAL turned billionaire, he built his fortune on security technology that now protected some of the same men who underestimated him. Unlike Richard, Alexander didn't crave attention, he commanded respect. When he entered a gala, whispers followed. When he spoke, the room listened. And soon, these two worlds, Richard's world of arrogance and Alexander's world of quiet, lethal power, were about to collide. For Emily, the cold marble halls of wealth had always felt like a prison. But destiny was preparing to turn them into a battlefield. The gala nights, the penthouse suites, the boardrooms dripping with greed, all would bear witness not just to betrayal, but to revenge. In the city of glass and gold, secrets can shatter faster than crystal under a single blow. Richard Carter wasn't always the monster who raised a club against his pregnant wife. To the outside world, he was a polished success story, a handsome real estate executive who had clawed his way out of middle-class obscurity to become one of Manhattan's rising moguls. He wore tailored suits like armor, drove imported cars that screamed power, and attended galas as though the city itself had rolled out a red carpet just for him. People admired Richard's charm. He knew how to smile just right, how to tell a story that made investors believe in him, and how to shift blame when deals soured. To colleagues, he was a leader. To the press, he was a symbol of ambition. But behind the closed doors of the Carter penthouse, the mask slipped. Richard was a man poisoned by insecurity. Every success felt fragile, every compliment not enough. He needed more wealth, more attention, more control. And when Emily, once the perfect accessory for his public image, became pregnant, he saw her not as a partner, but as dead weight. Into that hunger stepped Vanessa Lee. Vanessa was 25, a receptionist at one of Richard's development offices, and she knew exactly how to use her beauty. She was sharp, ambitious, and ruthless in ways Richard admired. Where Emily offered kindness, Vanessa offered fire. She whispered promises of a life without nagging responsibilities, without diapers and doctor bills. She told Richard he deserved better, that he was too powerful to be chained to a school teacher with swollen ankles and morning sickness. It didn't take long before Richard believed her. Soon, Vanessa was no longer a secret. He brought her to corporate events, let her sit in meetings, even allowed her to handle deals far above her position. For Richard, flaunting her wasn't just about passion, it was about humiliation. He wanted Emily to know she had been replaced. Their relationship thrived on cruelty. Vanessa encouraged Richard's temper, rolling her eyes whenever he showed the slightest kindness toward Emily. She laughed when he mocked his wife's frugality, when he tossed aside baby clothes Emily had carefully chosen. Vanessa didn't just steal Emily's husband, she fueled the fire that made him dangerous. And Richard, desperate for validation, fed on it. He became bolder, more reckless. He shouted at Emily in public, tightened his grip on her finances, and demanded obedience. Vanessa's presence at his side made him feel untouchable. He believed he could discard his wife and unborn child the same way he discarded failing properties. But Richard's arrogance blinded him. He didn't realize that every insult, every bruise, every betrayal was creating something he couldn't control. Emily's quiet determination and the storm brewing in the shadows. Alexander Kane's return. Vanessa, meanwhile, believed she had won. She pictured herself in Emily's place, living in the penthouse, dripping in diamonds, basking in the envy of Manhattan's elite. She didn't care that Richard's temper was violent. She thought she could control it. She thought she could control him. But villains who dance on the backs of the innocent always forget one truth. Power built on cruelty never lasts. Richard Carter thought he was untouchable, and Vanessa Lee thought she had secured her crown. But both were about to learn that betrayal is a debt, and Alexander Kane had come to collect. And when a billionaire ex-soldier collects, he leaves nothing standing.